Unfaithful wife enraged as my daughter refuses to conceal her shocking affair with him. So, my folks tried to get me to shift my wedding day because of some trip my brother had planned. I told them flat out no, and now the whole family's giving me the cold shoulder. I'm 28, got a steady job working 9 to 5, and I've been handling my own life just fine. Me and my fiancée, Erin, we've been a couple for over 4 years now. We got engaged about a year ago, and we're finally putting together this wedding I've been thinking about forever. I've been busting my tail for the past 4 months, figuring out every little thing to make it perfect. We sent out the invites, picked a date, and I was counting on all our friends and family showing up. That was the idea, at least. My parents, Brandon and Daisy, they're something else. Dad's 58, works construction, and he's the kind of guy who just goes along with whatever's happening, keeps his mouth shut most of the time. Mom's 55, been staying home raising us since I was a kid. They've always had a big soft spot for my older brother, Fred, he's 32. Honestly, soft spot doesn't even cut it, he's their pride and joy, the one they always put first. Fred's a wild one, I'll give him that. He's got big dreams, always chasing some new idea, but nothing he tries ever works out. He's started a bunch of businesses that went nowhere, and he acts like the next plan's going to make him a millionaire. He's hitched to Alice, she's 30, and they've got 2 little ones, Ethan, who's 5, and Jenna, who's 3. I don't got any beef with them myself, but everybody knows they spend way more than they've got. My parents are always there, throwing money their way to keep them afloat, like it's just part of the deal now. Fred and his crew lean hard on Mom and Dad's help, while I've been out here making my own way. When Erin popped the question, I was pumped to tell the family, even knowing Fred might stir up trouble. I tried to keep my head up about it. I remember when we broke the news, we had a little party at our place, just the close folks. I was all fired up to share it, and for a second, I thought maybe Mom and Dad would be excited for me, not just stuck on Fred. But sure enough, Fred and Alice took over. Right as we're talking about the engagement, Fred jumps in, going on about some new business he's cooking up and how they might get a bigger house. Suddenly, nobody's talking about me and Erin anymore, it's all Fred's show. It got under my skin, but I didn't want to start a fight, so I let it go. Erin saw it, though, and that night he told me he liked how I kept cool. That meant a lot. Picking the wedding day was a whole thing too. We settled on a date 4 months down the road, plenty of time for everybody to get ready. I even ran it by my parents first, making sure it didn't clash with anything they had going. They said it was fine, they'd be there, no worries. I figured that was that, but I should have seen it coming, nothing's ever that simple with them. I went all in on planning. We found this gorgeous spot for the ceremony, chose some nice flowers, and I tracked down a dress that's just right. Things were coming together, and I was getting more pumped by the day. This was our moment, me and Erin's big celebration, with all the people we care about around us. I even put Fred and Alice in the wedding lineup, thinking it might keep things smooth. But way down inside, I knew trouble was on its way, and it hit when my parents called me up out of nowhere, sounding all serious. They wanted to talk about the wedding, and it didn't sound like good news. A few weeks back, they dropped this bomb, they'd set up a vacation with Fred and his family. At first, I thought they meant after the wedding, but no, they were talking about the exact same week we'd locked in. They asked if I could push the whole thing back because it messed with their travel plans. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd been working on this for months, got the invites out, booked the place, the food, everything, and now they're acting like it's no big deal to change it, like it's just some barbecue I can move around. My day, the one me and Erin were building up to, suddenly didn't matter as much as some spur-of-the-moment trip with Fred. I kept my cool as best I could, but I was steaming mad. I asked them straight up why they'd pick a vacation that close to the date we'd already settled on. Mom goes, well, you know Fred's got a packed schedule, and this was the only time they could all make it work. I was floored. They were putting Fred's getaway ahead of my wedding. I told them moving the date wasn't happening, everything was done, and I wasn't about to rearrange it all for Fred's trip. Dad tried to smooth it over, saying maybe I could just call the venue and see if they'd swap days, but I shot that down fast. The date was set, end of story. When I wouldn't budge, Mom got all worked up, saying I was being hard-headed. She started in about how family's supposed to come first and how I was making it tough on everybody by digging my heels in. She even said I was trying to mess up their bond with Fred and his crew. That stung, but I held firm. I told them I wasn't shifting the date, and if they couldn't show up, that was their call. They went quiet for a bit, then Mom said they'd have to think it over. They hung up without so much as a goodbye. I couldn't wrap my head around it. My own parents were actually thinking about skipping my wedding over a vacation. Aaron was spitting mad for me and pushed me to call them back, see if we could sort it out. So I did, hoping we could meet halfway, but it went sideways. I laid out how much this wedding meant to me, how long I'd been at it, and how much it hurt that they'd even suggest moving it. But they wouldn't give. Mom kept calling me stubborn, and Dad just said Fred's family already had their plans locked in, like it didn't matter that I'd done the same way earlier. It was like arguing with a wall. That's when I figured I had to bring in the rest of the family. I called up my aunt, who I'm tight with, and told her what was going on. She couldn't believe it either and said she'd talk to my parents. I was hoping she'd get through to them, make them see how crazy this was. But instead of easing off, they doubled down. They started phoning around to other relatives, making me out to be the bad guy. They said I wouldn't bend, that I was causing trouble for everybody. They even hinted I was jealous of Fred and trying to stick it to him by keeping the date. It was nonsense, but some folks started buying it, saying I ought to be more easygoing and think about Fred's family. It hit me then, they were trying to guilt me into caving. They were piling on the family pressure to force me to shift the date. But I wasn't backing down. I had every right to keep my wedding when I'd planned it, and I wasn't letting them wreck it just to suit Fred. So I told them the date was staying put, and if they couldn't make it, that was on them, but I wasn't changing a thing, and that was that. So, I put it out there on Reddit, am I the jerk for not moving my wedding date because of Fred's big vacation? Folks online came through with a ton of support and ideas, and I'm real thankful for everybody who chimed in. A bunch of them said there might be more to my parents' sudden trip than they were letting on. That got my wheels turning, so I decided to poke around a little. I went back to my aunt, who's been like another mom to me. She knows how my parents are with Fred, so none of this shocked her. But when I brought up the vacation, she clammed up for a second. Then she let on that she'd heard Fred was in deep trouble again, money-wise. Word was his latest business had tanked, and he was drowning in bills. My parents had been tossing him cash to stay afloat, but it wasn't cutting it. Fred was in a panic, scrambling to keep from sinking. Turns out that vacation wasn't what it seemed. My parents were hauling Fred and his family over to Europe, but it wasn't for fun. They were chasing down some investors Fred had dug up overseas. The trip was their last shot at getting somebody to pump money into Fred's business before it all fell apart. They were betting everything on it to pull Fred out of the hole, and that's why they were so dead set on going. When I found out, I was boiling. It wasn't just about a trip, it was my parents picking Fred over me again, even if it meant ditching my wedding to clean up another one of his messes. Once I had the real story, I knew I had to face Fred head-on. I rang him up and said we needed to meet. I didn't tell him why, I didn't want him cooking up some story ahead of time. When we sat down, I didn't beat around the bush. I said I knew about the trip, the investors, and his money problems. He tried to shrug it off at first, saying it was just a side deal that happened to line up with my wedding, but I wasn't having it. He got all prickly, saying I didn't get how much heat he was under, how he was busting his hump for his family. I told him this wasn't his first rodeo, he'd been digging these holes for years, and Mom and Dad always pulled him out. Finally, Fred fessed up, things were rough. His business was about to go under, and if he didn't land these investors, he'd lose it all. But instead of owning it, he tried to lay a guilt trip on me. He said I ought to help him out, being his sister and all, even if it meant bumping my wedding. He called me selfish, said I didn't care about his family. That was it for me. I told him I'd backed him up plenty over the years, but I wasn't tossing my wedding day under the bus for his bad calls. I made it clear the date wasn't moving, and if he couldn't show, that was his problem. I walked off and left him there. After that, I figured I'd talk to Alice. I wasn't sure what she knew, and I wanted her take on it. We grabbed coffee, and she looked antsy right off the bat, probably guessed I wasn't there to gab about flowers. I asked her point blank what she knew about Fred's mess and the Europe trip. She said she knew they were strapped for cash but didn't have the full scoop. Fred had kept her in the dark to shield her, but she knew it was bad. When I spilled the truth about the trip being for investors, her jaw dropped. She had no clue my parents were using it to try and save Fred's business. Alice admitted she'd been fretting over Fred's wild spending for a while, but he just brushed her off whenever she brought it up. She also said she wasn't keen on missing the wedding, but Fred had sold her on the trip being make or break for them. She got real down when I told her how much this was tearing me up and splitting the family. I could tell she was stuck, wanting to stand by Fred but not wanting to be why my parents bailed on me. She said she'd try talking to him, see if they could sort it another way, but I didn't hold out much hope. Fred's as stubborn as they come. I walked away from that feeling a touch better, knowing Alice wasn't all in on this scheme, but I also figured Fred would do whatever he wanted, no matter who it hit. With all this piling up, I realized we couldn't keep dodging it. The only way through was to get everybody in one room and hash it out. I didn't know how it'd turn out, but if we didn't tackle it straight, it'd just fester worse. So, I decided it was time to get everybody together and sort this mess out. I called up my parents, Fred, and Alice, told them we were having a sit-down, no dodging it, no putting it off. We agreed to meet at Mom and Dad's place. Aaron tagged along to back me up, and I was real glad to have him there. When we walked in, my parents were already waiting, looking antsy as all get out. Fred and Alice showed up a bit later, and Fred had this chip on his shoulder right from the jump. We all piled into the living room, and I didn't mess around, I got straight to it. I told them I'd figured out Fred's money troubles and the real deal behind that Europe trip. Mom and Dad looked like I just dropped a bomb on them. Fred tried to play it off like it was nothing, but I wasn't letting that slide. I laid it all out, no holding back. I told them how they'd been picking Fred over me for years, always tossing him cash to dig him out of his holes, and this was just the latest kick in the teeth. I said I got that they wanted to look out for him, but there's got to be a limit, and this was where I drew it. I went on about how much this wedding meant to me, how I'd poured my guts into planning it, and how it crushed me that they'd ditch it for some trip. Then I brought out the proof I'd dug up, copies of emails and messages they'd sent back and forth about the trip, the investors, and keeping it hush-hush. I just remembered a couple passwords, that's how I got it. I even had their travel schedule, showing it was smack in the middle of my wedding week. Mom and Dad looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, and Fred was steaming mad that I'd snooped around. I didn't give a darn. I wasn't about to let them keep twisting me up or making me feel bad for wanting my wedding to go off like I'd planned. I dropped another bombshell: Alice wasn't all in on this trip idea, and that caught Fred off guard. He shot her a look, but she just stared off, proving I was right. Fred lost it then, hollering that I was out to wreck his life, saying I was jealous cause he was the big shot in the family. Mom started bawling, going on about how she just wanted to help both her kids and didn't want to pick sides. Dad didn't say a word, which just fired me up more. He's always stayed out of the mess, but this time, I needed him to step up. Then Alice piped up, saying she didn't feel right about skipping the wedding, especially now that she knew what was really going on. She told them they had to find some other way to fix Fred's business mess without stomping on family stuff. Fred looked ready to argue, but she didn't back down. I'll admit, I respected her a little for that. But I wasn't finished. I told them they had a choice to make: either they stuck with this trip and missed my wedding, or they figured out a different way to help Fred that didn't mean leaving me high and dry. I made it crystal clear I wasn't budging on the date, and if they couldn't deal with that, they were choosing their path. I gave them 24 hours to figure it out. I said if they didn't pick the wedding, I was done with them. I wasn't going to keep letting them treat me like I didn't count, and I wasn't letting them ruin my big day. I even let slip that if they pushed me too far, I'd spill the whole story wide open. Fred couldn't afford those investors hearing about his cash problems, and I knew that was my ace in the hole. Mom and Dad looked like they'd been run over, Fred was ticked, and Alice just seemed down. I didn't want it to come to this, but I was sick of getting shoved aside, always playing second to Fred's nonsense. I got up, told them they knew where to find me, and walked out with Aaron. After that showdown, things got rough. I didn't hear a peep from my parents or Fred, and I had no clue what they'd do. So there I was, just waiting to see if Mom and Dad would finally put me first or if this was the end of the road for us. Now, here's the update. After what felt like forever, my parents finally called. Those 24 hours dragged on like a lifetime, and I couldn't think straight while I waited to hear their answer. When the phone rang, I didn't know what was coming, and part of me didn't even want to pick up. Mom kicked things off with an apology. She said they'd been chewing over everything I'd said last time we talked. They figured out how much this wedding mattered to me and how wrong they'd been to push me to change it. She owned up to getting too caught up in pulling Fred out of his latest jam, not seeing how bad they were hurting me along the way. Then she hit me with it. They were scrapping the Europe trip. They were coming to the wedding instead. I couldn't believe my ears. I'd braced myself for them picking Fred again, so hearing they chose my day over his trip took a load off. Dad got on the line next, backing up what Mom said. He said sorry for not stepping in sooner and swore they'd be there when I tied the knot. He added they were starting to see how Fred's problems had been dragging the whole family down, and they needed to rethink how they'd been handling it. It wasn't the big, tear-jerking sorry I'd hoped for, but it was something. They were showing up, and that's what counted. I thanked them for coming around, and we hung up on a better note than I'd expected. For the first time in a long stretch, I thought maybe we could turn things around. Once they made up their minds, Mom and Dad got right to work canceling that Europe trip. They broke the news to Fred, and like you'd figure, he didn't take it well. He was madder than a wet hen. He called me up right away, wanting to know what I'd told them to kill his plans. I kept it simple. I said I just laid out the truth, that having them at my wedding meant everything to me, and they had to pick what mattered more. Fred started in, saying I tricked them, that I was out to tank his shot at fixing his business. He even threw out that I was sabotaging him because I was jealous. Same old tune he's been singing forever, but this time, it didn't faze me. I told him calm as could be that his troubles weren't my doing, and Mom and Dad chose for themselves. If he wanted to be mad, he could take it up with them, not me. He hung up after that, and I didn't hear from him for a bit. I was fretting some about how this might mess with the wedding, but I was also breathing easier knowing my parents were finally seeing things clearer. They'd picked me this time, and that felt like progress. Over the next few days, they started digging into how they'd been dealing with me and Fred. Mom called a couple times to see how I was holding up, and one time, she let on that her and Dad had been talking a lot about how they raised us. She said they'd always figured Fred needed more looking after cause of all his flops, but they'd ended up shortchanging me, taking for granted that I could handle myself. She told me they were waking up to how much they'd let me down by always putting Fred ahead. Dad was the one who'd started that talk, she said, pointing out they needed to do better by me and Aaron, not just when stuff hit the fan, but all the time. It wasn't a total turnaround, but it was the first time they'd ever straight up admitted they'd played favorites. They said they'd try harder to be there for me and treat us kids even. It was a lot to take in, and I wasn't sure how much would stick, but it was a beginning. They sounded like they meant it, and that gave me a little hope we could patch things up down the road. Fred, though, he was still fuming, but Mom and Dad weren't letting that steer them anymore. They were catching on that always bailing him out wasn't doing anybody any good, not him, not them, not us as a family. They even dropped a hint they might start drawing some lines with him, which I never thought I'd hear come out of their mouths. Naturally, Fred didn't just roll over. When he saw they were dead serious about ditching the trip and showing up for my wedding, he turned up the heat to drag them back to his side. He started throwing out wild threats, even saying he might haul Mom and Dad into court if they didn't stick with the trip. He claimed they'd promised to help his business, and if they backed out, he'd sue them for breaking that promise. It was a long shot, and I reckon Fred knew it deep down, but it showed how desperate he was to keep them in his corner. Mom and Dad didn't flinch. They told him their call was final, and he needed to sort his own mess without leaning on them so hard. That was a big move for them, and even though it wasn't easy to stand up to Fred, they knew it had to happen. But Fred wasn't done. He started hitting up other kin, trying to rally them behind him. He made me out to be the bad guy, saying I'd conned our parents into dropping the trip just to screw him over. It stirred up some static with the wider family. Some bought his line and took his side, but most saw right through it and backed Mom and Dad's choice to put my wedding first. No matter how hard Fred tried, his old tricks weren't working like they used to. Folks were starting to catch on to what he was really about, a guy always holding his hand out instead of owning up to his own messes. All this mess has split the family right down the middle. Some of our kin are dead set on Fred's side, thinking Mom and Dad should have stuck to helping him no matter what. They look at me like I'm some bratty little sister using my wedding to tear everybody apart. But others, especially the ones who've watched Fred drag my parents down for years, they're behind their choice to come to my wedding and start putting some walls up with him. Family get-togethers feel heavy now, like everybody's picking teams without saying it out loud. I can feel the dirty looks from the ones who reckon I'm the problem, but I'm doing my best not to let it eat at me. Aaron's been a rock, keeping me looking at the bright side, like how we're still rolling ahead with the wedding and how Mom and Dad are going to be there for us. It ain't a picnic, though. I keep wondering what this is going to do to us all down the line. Can we patch this up, or is it just going to keep ripping wider till there's no fixing it? I don't know yet, but I've got to stick to my guns. I can't keep bending over to make everybody else happy, not when it's my own joy on the line. As for Fred, I can't say what's coming for him. He's still scrambling to keep his business alive, but without Mom and Dad's money propping him up, it's a steep climb. For now, me and Aaron are keeping our eyes on the wedding and the life we're starting together. It's been a rough ride, but I've got a good feeling that these shifts in the family might just lead to something better, something fairer for all of us in the end. Now, here's the next bit. The wedding day finally rolled around. After all the chaos leading up to it, I just wanted everything to go perfect. Me and Aaron had put our hearts into making it special, and I was praying for a smooth run. My maid of honor, Nancy, who's been my buddy since college days, kept telling me it was all about me and Aaron, nothing else mattered. We got ready at this stunning garden estate we'd picked out. The second we saw it, we knew it was the one. I was sure Mom and Dad were coming, but I hadn't talked to Fred since our last blowout. I didn't know if he'd show, and the idea of him starting something was gnawing at me. The ceremony was a dream. When we said our vows, I felt like the luckiest guy alive. Mom and Dad were right up front, and I caught Mom dabbing her eyes when I snuck a look. It was a small thing, but it hit me hard, like maybe we were finally getting somewhere. The whole thing was just what I'd wanted, small, with our closest people, and the preacher made it feel real and personal. Afterward, we snapped pictures out in the garden. The sunlight was spot on, and the place looked like something out of a storybook. Mom and Dad joined in for some family photos, and yeah, it was still a little stiff, but you could tell they were happy for us. They were making an effort, and that warmed me up inside. The reception came next, and the speeches got me right in the chest. Dad even threw me for a loop. He stood up and gave this honest toast, saying sorry for all the trouble lately and telling everybody how proud he was of who I turned into. It was a big deal coming from him, and while it didn't wipe out the past, it felt like a fresh start. I was starting to think the day was going to roll by smooth, but then Fred and Alice walked in. They hadn't said they were coming, so I'd been in the dark about it. They showed up smack in the middle of the reception, and the room went hush for a second. Fred had this look like he was out to prove something. He went over to Mom and Dad first, had a quick, quiet word with them, then headed our way. Alice stayed back, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. When Fred got to us, he said congrats, but it was plain as day he wasn't there to cheer. He was there to make a point. Right there, at our reception, he started yapping about his business woes like he couldn't handle not being the main show, even on our day. Aaron jumped in before I could open my mouth. He told Fred, cool and steady, that this wasn't the spot for that talk, that today was about us getting hitched. Fred didn't like that one bit. He tried to push back, but Aaron shut it down. Finally, Fred backed off and stormed away, but he'd already stirred the pot. I did my darndest to shake it off and keep the night going. We danced, cut the cake, and hung out with our crew. Even with Fred trying to throw a wrench in it, the evening wrapped up on a high. I was married to the love of my life, and Fred couldn't take that from me, no matter what he pulled. Now, Fred's world's taken a turn. After the wedding, Mom and Dad made a tough call. They cut off the cash flow. They figured out that always pulling him out of the fire wasn't helping him grow up, and it was time he dealt with what he'd done. Without their support, Fred's business tanked fast. He tried chasing down other investors, but with that Europe trip off the table, nothing panned out. In the end, he had to file for bankruptcy. It hit him hard, knocked his pride down a few pegs. Alice had been getting more and more fed up with Fred's money stunts, and she hit her limit. She packed up the kids and left, moving in with her folks while she sorts out what's next. Fred's staring down being on his own now, having to build back up from nothing. I ain't happy to see him crash, but I reckon this might be the shakeup he's needed. Maybe he'll start owning his life instead of waiting for everybody else to fix it. We'll see how it plays out. As for me and Aaron, we're finally free to look ahead without all this family junk weighing us down. We're talking about kids soon. We've also lined up a honeymoon in Europe, had to push it back cause of all the wedding ruckus, but it feels like the right way to kick off this new part of our lives. I've got to give a shout out to all the folks on Reddit who threw advice and support my way through this wild ride. What you all said gave me the guts to stand tall and make some hard calls I might have ducked otherwise. It wasn't a breeze, but I'm mighty glad I held my ground.